Richard Wolff was a man who loved to talk, and not just any kind of talk. His words were sharp, pointed, and often laced with sarcasm. He had made a career out of tearing apart ideas he didn't agree with, especially when it came to politics and economics. Known for his deep voice and no-nonsense attitude, Wolff had become something of a celebrity in intellectual circles. People either loved him or hated him, but they couldn't ignore him. One evening, Richard found himself sitting across from a host on a popular cable news show. The topic? None other than Donald Trump, the former president who still managed to dominate headlines years after leaving office. Wolff leaned back in his chair, adjusted his glasses, and began speaking. His tone was casual at first, almost playful, but soon turned biting as he launched into one of his signature critiques. "Let's be honest," he said, smirking slightly. "Donald Trump's economic policies were like throwing spaghetti at the wall and hoping something sticks. Tax cuts for the wealthy? Sure, why not? Deregulation without thinking about consequences? Absolutely. It's chaos wrapped up in shiny packaging, sold to people who don't know any better." The audience laughed nervously, unsure whether to applaud or cringe. Some nodded along, agreeing with every word. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, feeling the sting of his words. But Richard wasn't done yet. He leaned forward now, his voice rising ever so slightly. "And let's not forget the supporters," he continued, his tone dripping with mockery. "They cheer for this stuff like it's some miracle cure for all their problems. Do they even understand what these policies mean? Or are they just blindly following someone who tells them what they want to hear?" The studio erupted in laughter again, though this time it felt forced. A few people clapped politely while others exchanged awkward glances. Richard basked in the moment, clearly enjoying himself. To him, this was easy. He'd spent decades studying economics, teaching students, and debating opponents. This was his playground, and he knew how to win. But what Richard didn't realize was that somewhere else, far away from the bright lights of the TV studio, someone was watching and taking notes. Back in her apartment, a young woman sat glued to the screen. She had tuned in casually, flipping through channels after a long day of work, when she stumbled upon the interview. At first, she listened with mild interest, nodding occasionally as Richard made valid points. But as his tone grew more condescending, her expression changed. Her brow furrowed and she leaned closer to the TV, gripping the remote tightly. This woman wasn't just any viewer. She worked in politics, specifically Republican politics, and she knew a thing or two about defending ideas under fire. Richard's words weren't just annoying, they felt personal. They struck at the heart of everything she believed in and fought for daily. As he mocked Trump supporters, she thought about the countless conversations she'd had with ordinary Americans, people struggling to make ends meet, looking for leaders who understood their struggles. By the time Richard finished his rant, she was seething. Not because she disagreed with everything he said, she could admit there were flaws in any system, but because of the way he dismissed entire groups of people. It wasn't just an attack on policies, it was an attack on human beings. And that, she decided, wouldn't go unanswered. Later that night, as the segment replayed online, she grabbed her phone and opened Twitter. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before typing out a response. What started as a single tweet quickly turned into a thread, dissecting Richard's arguments point by point. She cited facts, shared anecdotes, and called out the hypocrisy in his statements. By morning, her posts had gone viral, drawing attention from both sides of the political spectrum. Richard, scrolling through notifications the next day, couldn't believe what he saw. Someone, a relatively unknown figure in the grand scheme of things, had challenged him publicly. Worse yet, people seemed to agree with her. For the first time in a long time, Richard felt a flicker of doubt. Maybe he had underestimated his opponent. Maybe this wouldn't be as easy as he thought. Little did he know this was only the beginning. The young woman sat back in her chair, staring at the glowing screen of her laptop. Her fingers rested lightly on the keyboard as she scrolled through the hundreds of replies flooding her Twitter thread. Some were messages of support, thanking her for standing up to someone they saw as arrogant and dismissive. Others were insults, accusing her of being naive or biased. But none of that mattered right now. What mattered was the fire burning inside her, a mix of frustration, determination, and something else she couldn't quite name. She had spent years working behind the scenes in politics, crafting messages, strategizing campaigns, and defending policies that many dismissed without even trying to understand. She knew what it felt like to be underestimated, written off as just another faceless staffer in a world dominated by louder voices. But this time was different. This wasn't about her career or her ego. It was about the people whose stories she carried with her every day. The factory workers, small business owners, farmers, and families who believed in a vision of America that others often mocked. Richard's words from the night before still echoed in her mind. The way he'd sneered at Trump supporters, calling them uninformed or willfully ignorant, it hit too close to home. She thought about the single mom she'd met during a campaign stop, juggling 2 jobs while advocating for better childcare policies. Or the retired veteran who proudly displayed his service medals next to a photo of him shaking hands with Donald Trump. These weren't caricatures or statistics. They were real people with hopes, dreams, and struggles. And Richard had reduced them to punchlines. Her phone buzzed on the desk beside her, pulling her out of her thoughts. A notification popped up. Richard Wolff responds. Her heart skipped a beat as she clicked on the link. Sure enough, there it was. A tweet from Richard himself, addressing her thread directly. At first glance, it seemed almost playful, like he was amused by her audacity. But as she read further, his tone shifted. He called her arguments simplistic and accused her of cherry-picking facts to suit her narrative. Then came the line that made her blood boil. If you think you can defend these policies better than I can dismantle them, let's see you try. It was a challenge, one that could easily have been ignored. After all, debating someone like Richard Wolff wasn't exactly low risk. He was a seasoned academic with decades of experience, a polished speaker who thrived in intellectual arenas. Going head-to-head with him would mean stepping into territory where she might not belong, or, so some would say. But sitting there in her tiny apartment surrounded by books and papers, she realized something important. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about showing up. Without hesitating, she typed out her response. "Challenge accepted," she wrote, keeping it short and direct. Within minutes, her followers exploded with excitement. Supporters cheered her bravery, while critics questioned whether she was walking into a trap. Either way, the internet was buzzing, and Richard's team quickly reached out to arrange the details of the debate. As the days passed, anticipation grew. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as a clash of ideologies, one side representing progressive academia, the other embodying grassroots conservatism. Social media lit up with memes and hashtags, turning what could have been a niche event into a cultural moment. People started taking sides, sharing their predictions and speculating about who would come out on top. For her part, the young woman threw herself into preparation. She spent hours poring over data, revisiting speeches and studying policy documents. She reached out to colleagues and mentors asking for advice and feedback. Late at night, when the city outside her window fell silent, she rehearsed her arguments aloud, imagining how Richard might respond. Each practice session left her more confident but also more aware of the stakes. This wasn't just about proving a point. It was about giving a voice to those who rarely got to speak for themselves. Meanwhile, Richard seemed unfazed by the mounting pressure. To him, this was familiar ground. Over the years, he had debated countless opponents, always emerging victorious, or, at least unscathed. His confidence bordered on arrogance, but it wasn't entirely unwarranted. He had built his reputation on dismantling opposing viewpoints with logic and wit, leaving audiences dazzled and adversaries tongue-tied. In his mind, this debate would be no different. But as the date approached, subtle signs began to emerge that perhaps Richard wasn't as invincible as he appeared. Friends and colleagues noticed a change in his demeanor, small cracks in his usual armor of self-assurance. During interviews leading up to the event, he spoke about the upcoming debate with an edge of irritation, brushing off questions about his opponent with dismissive remarks. When pressed, He admitted that he hadn't anticipated such a strong reaction to his initial comments. "I didn't expect her to take it so personally," he muttered during one interview, his tone betraying a hint of unease. Back in her corner of the world, the young woman remained laser-focused. She knew Richard was a formidable opponent, but she also knew something he didn't. Passion trumps polish every time. While he relied on facts and figures, she drew strength from the stories of real people, the ones who inspired her to keep fighting, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. On the morning of the debate, she woke up early, brewed a cup of coffee, and took a long look at herself in the mirror. Today wasn't about proving Richard wrong or silencing his critiques. It was about standing tall, speaking truth, and reminding everyone watching that ideas matter, not because they're perfect, but because they shape lives. As she stepped out the door, ready to face whatever lay ahead, she felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. Whatever happened next, she told herself, she wouldn't regret showing up. The day of the debate arrived faster than anyone expected. For weeks, social media had been buzzing with speculation, memes, and heated arguments between supporters on both sides. Some people were excited to see how this unlikely matchup would play out, while others were skeptical. How could a relatively unknown political staffer hold her own against someone like Richard Wolff? But one thing was clear: everyone wanted to watch. The event was set to take place in a neutral venue, a sleek modern studio designed to host high-profile discussions. Cameras lined the walls, ready to capture every moment from multiple angles. A respected journalist had agreed to moderate, ensuring that neither side would dominate the conversation unfairly. As the clock ticked closer to showtime, the energy in the room crackled with tension. Richard walked into the studio first, dressed impeccably in his signature blazer and tie. He carried himself with an air of confidence, nodding politely at the crew as he made his way to his seat. His demeanor suggested he already knew the outcome of the evening. He'd crush his opponent with logic and wit, just as he always did. He adjusted his microphone, glanced at his notes one last time, and leaned back in his chair, waiting for the challenger to arrive. A few minutes later, she entered the room. Unlike Richard, who exuded polish and authority, she looked approachable and grounded. Dressed in a simple yet professional outfit, she greeted the staff warmly, shaking hands and exchanging small talk before taking her place at the table. Her calm exterior masked the storm of nerves brewing inside her. This wasn't just another day at work. It was a chance to represent millions of people who rarely got a voice in spaces like this. She took a deep breath, reminding herself why she was here. As the moderator introduced the topic, the audience settled into their seats, phones held high to record every word. The stage was set. The lights dimmed slightly, focusing attention on the two figures seated across from each other. One represented decades of academic expertise and intellectual rigor. The other embodied grassroots determination and real-world experience. It was David versus Goliath, or so it seemed. The moderator kicked things off by asking Richard to present his opening statement. He didn't hesitate. Leaning forward, he launched into a well-rehearsed monologue, laying out his critique of Trump-era policies with precision. His delivery was smooth, almost hypnotic, as he cited economic theories and historical examples to support his claims. He spoke about tax cuts benefiting only the wealthy, deregulation harming vulnerable communities, and trade wars destabilizing global markets. Every point was backed by numbers and charts, projected onto screens behind him for dramatic effect. But what really caught everyone's attention was his tone. Richard wasn't just presenting facts, he was mocking the very idea of defending such policies. "Let's be honest," he said with a smirk, glancing briefly at his opponent. "These aren't strategies, they're slogans wrapped in glitter. They sound good on TV, but they fall apart under scrutiny." The audience chuckled nervously, unsure whether to applaud or stay silent. Some nodded along, clearly impressed by his command of the material. Others shifted uncomfortably, sensing the condescension beneath his polished words. When he finished, there was polite applause, though it felt more obligatory than enthusiastic. Then it was her turn. She rose slightly in her chair, adjusting the microphone to fit her height. For a moment she paused, letting the weight of the moment sink in. Then she began to speak. Not with the same rehearsed cadence as Richard, but with a quiet conviction that demanded attention. "I want to start by acknowledging something," she said, looking directly at the camera. "There are flaws in any system, including the ones we're discussing today. No policy is perfect, and no leader is infallible. But here's what I believe matters most: intent. Why do we make these decisions? Who do they serve? And how do they impact real people?" Her voice grew stronger as she continued, weaving personal stories into her argument. She talked about meeting a farmer in Iowa whose business thrived after tariffs were adjusted, allowing him to compete fairly in international markets. She described a single mother in Ohio who found affordable childcare thanks to tax reforms that put more money back in her pocket. These weren't abstract concepts or statistics, they were human experiences, brought to life through her words. "When we talk about economics," she said firmly, "we can't just look at graphs and equations. We have to look at faces. We have talked enough about GDP growth and stock market gains. But what about the person working 2 jobs to keep their family afloat? What about the small business owner trying to navigate new regulations? Those stories matter too." The room fell silent. Even Richard seemed momentarily taken aback by the shift in tone. While his arguments had been technical and detached, hers were raw and relatable. She wasn't just defending policies, she was championing people, and the audience could feel it. When she finished, the applause was louder this time, genuine and heartfelt. People exchanged glances, whispering to each other about how unexpected her performance had been. For the first time that evening, Richard looked uneasy. He hadn't anticipated this kind of response. His confidence wavered ever so slightly, though he quickly masked it with a practiced smile. The moderator stepped in again, steering the conversation toward specific topics like job creation, healthcare, and environmental regulations. Each question gave Richard another opportunity to showcase his knowledge, peppering his answers with jargon and references to obscure studies. But every time he spoke, she countered with clarity and simplicity, breaking down complex issues into terms anyone could understand. By the halfway mark, the dynamic had shifted. Richard's superior attitude began to wear thin, especially when he resorted to interrupting her mid-sentence or dismissing her points outright. The audience noticed, growing increasingly restless whenever he interrupted or rolled his eyes. Meanwhile, she remained composed, never raising her voice or losing her temper. Instead, she used his interruptions to her advantage, turning them into opportunities to highlight his dismissiveness. At one point, when Richard accused her of oversimplifying the issues, she smiled calmly and replied, "Sometimes, simplicity is strength. Not everyone has the luxury of spending years studying economics. Most people just want to know if a policy helps them feed their kids or pay their bills. That's not oversimplification. It's reality." The line drew spontaneous, applause catching both Richard and the moderator off guard. It was a turning point in the debate, one that signaled a shift in momentum. From that moment on, the audience was unmistakably on her side. As the segment neared its conclusion, the moderator asked each participant for a closing statement. Richard went first, delivering a passionate but somewhat disjointed summary of his arguments. He tried to regain control of the narrative, emphasizing the importance of evidence-based policymaking and warning against populist rhetoric. But his words lacked the punch they'd had earlier in the evening. Fatigue and perhaps frustration was starting to show. Then it was her turn. She stood up slowly, taking a moment to gather her thoughts. When she spoke, her voice was steady and full of purpose. "This isn't about left versus right or rich versus poor," she said, addressing the camera once again. "It's about listening to people and understanding their needs. Policies don't exist in a vacuum. They shape lives. So let's stop talking down to each other and start working together. Let's find solutions that lift everyone up, not just a select few." The audience erupted into applause, many rising to their feet. Cameras flashed, capturing the historic moment. Richard sat quietly in his chair, his expression unreadable. Whether he realized it or not, the tide had turned, and he was no longer in control. As the moderator thanked both participants and the crowd dispersed, the young woman stepped away from the table, feeling a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. She had come into the debate knowing she might not win, but she had succeeded in making her voice heard. And sometimes that's all that matters. The debate wasn't over yet, but the energy in the room had shifted dramatically. The audience was no longer passive spectators. They were fully engaged, leaning forward in their seats, reacting to every word with audible gasps, murmurs, or applause. Social media was exploding too. Hashtags related to the event were trending worldwide, and clips of key moments were being shared faster than anyone could keep up. This wasn't just a policy discussion anymore. It was a cultural moment. Richard, sensing the change in momentum, tried to regain control. He leaned into his strengths, facts, figures, and intellectual superiority. But now those tools felt less effective. His earlier mockery of Trump supporters had alienated much of the audience, and his attempts to dominate the conversation came across as condescending rather than authoritative. Still, he refused to back down. After all, this was what he did best, dismantling opponents with precision and wit. When the moderator posed a question about job growth during Trump's presidency, Richard seized the opportunity. "Let's talk numbers," he said confidently, gesturing toward the screen behind him where a graph displayed unemployment rates. Yes, there was a decline in unemployment before the pandemic hit. But let's not pretend this was some kind of miracle. These trends were already underway under previous administrations. What we saw was more of the same, dressed up in flashy rhetoric. He paused for effect, scanning the audience as if daring anyone to disagree. Then, turning to his opponent, he added, "And let's not forget the long-term consequences of these policies. Deregulation might create short-term gains, but at what cost? Environmental damage, worker exploitation, it's unsustainable." His points were valid, even compelling, but something felt off. The audience didn't respond with the enthusiasm he expected. Instead, many looked skeptical, their arms crossed or brows furrowed. They weren't buying it, not because they disagreed entirely, but because Richard's tone made it hard to connect with him. He spoke as though he were delivering a lecture, not engaging in a dialogue. Her turn came next. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before responding. Unlike Richard, she didn't rely on graphs or jargon. Instead, she painted a picture, one that resonated deeply with the people watching. "You're right," she began, nodding respectfully at Richard. "Numbers matter, trends matter, but so do stories. Let me tell you about someone I met in Michigan, a factory worker named John. For years, he watched his community crumble as jobs disappeared overseas. Then when new trade deals were negotiated, things started to change. His plant reopened, and suddenly he had hope again. Hope that he could provide for his family, save for retirement, maybe even take a vacation after decades of hard work." She paused, letting the image sink in. Now, you can argue all day about whether those changes were sustainable or perfect. But here's the thing. For John, and thousands like him, those policies meant something real. They meant dignity. They meant a future. And isn't that what we should be striving for? The room erupted into applause, louder and more sustained than before. People nodded along, some even wiping away tears. Her words weren't just arguments. They were reminders of why politics mattered in the first place. She wasn't talking about abstract theories or hypothetical scenarios. She was speaking directly to the hearts of ordinary Americans. Richard, visibly frustrated, attempted to counter her point. "Emotional appeals are powerful," he admitted, almost begrudgingly. "But they don't negate the need for sound economic principles. We can't base policy decisions solely on anecdotes. That's how we end up with flawed systems that benefit only a few." "Agreed," she shot back without missing a beat. "Emotions alone aren't enough, but neither is cold logic. Good policy finds a balance. It listens to both the data and the people affected by it. And honestly, I think we've swung too far in one direction. Too often, economists like yourself focus on the big picture while forgetting the individuals who make up that picture." Her response drew another wave of applause. Even some of Richard's supporters seemed conflicted, nodding reluctantly at her words. It was becoming clear that she wasn't just holding her ground. She was winning over the crowd. As the debate moved into its final stretch, Richard grew increasingly defensive. He accused her of cherry-picking examples and oversimplifying complex issues. At one point, he even suggested that her arguments were driven by ideology rather than reason. "You're defending these policies because they align with your political beliefs," he said sharply. "Not because they're objectively sound." The accusation hung heavy in the air. For a moment, silence filled the room. Everyone waited to see how she would respond. She didn't hesitate. "Of course my beliefs influence my perspective," she replied calmly. "Just like yours influence yours. None of us are completely objective. Not me, not you, not anyone. The difference is I'm willing to admit it. I'm also willing to listen, to hear perspectives different from my own and find common ground. Can you say the same?" The question struck a nerve. Richard opened his mouth to retort, then closed it again, clearly unsure how to proceed. For the first time that evening, he looked rattled. The audience noticed, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Some whispered among themselves while others simply stared, waiting for him to recover. But he never quite did. From that point on, his responses became shorter, sharper, and tinged with irritation. When the moderator asked about healthcare reform, he launched into a detailed explanation of universal systems versus privatized models, only to be interrupted by polite but firm corrections from her. She pointed out flaws in his assumptions, citing real-world examples of communities that thrived under mixed approaches. Each rebuttal chipped away at his credibility, leaving him looking less like an expert and more like someone clinging desperately to outdated ideas. By the time the closing statements rolled around, the outcome felt inevitable. Richard spoke first, delivering a polished but hollow summary of his arguments. He emphasized the importance of evidence-based policymaking and warned against populism, a message that might have landed earlier but now felt disconnected from the human element she had brought to the table. Then it was her turn. As she stood up, the room fell silent. Every eye was on her, every ear tuned in. She didn't rush. Instead, she took a moment to look around, making eye contact with members of the audience. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a quiet power that commanded attention. "This debate isn't just about policies or presidents," she said. "It's about respect. Respect for the people who wake up every morning, go to work, and try to build a better life for themselves and their families. It's about listening to their stories, understanding their struggles, and finding solutions that actually help them. Yes, we'll disagree on how to get there, and that's okay. Debate is healthy, but dismissing entire groups of people as uninformed or ignorant, that's not debate. That's arrogance." Her final words hung in the air, echoing long after she sat down. The audience erupted into thunderous applause, many rising to their feet in a standing ovation. Cameras flashed, capturing the historic moment. Richard, sitting quietly in his chair, offered a tight smile, but said nothing. Whether he realized it or not, he had been outmatched, not by superior knowledge but by authenticity. As the moderator wrapped up the event and thanked both participants, the young woman leaned back in her chair, exhaling deeply. She hadn't come into this expecting to win, but she had accomplished something far more important. She had reminded everyone watching that politics isn't just about numbers or theories, it's about people. And sometimes, that's all it takes to make a difference. The debate had reached its final moments, but the tension in the room was thicker than ever. Richard sat rigidly in his chair, his jaw clenched as he scribbled something on a notepad. His earlier confidence had faded, replaced by a simmering frustration that was hard to miss. Across the table, the young woman exuded calmness, her posture relaxed yet poised. She wasn't gloating, far from it, but there was an unmistakable sense of satisfaction in her expression. She had done what she set out to do, give voice to those who rarely got heard. As the moderator prepared to wrap up the event, Richard suddenly leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Before we conclude," he said, interrupting the moderator, mid-sentence, "I'd like to address something my opponent mentioned earlier. His tone was sharp, almost accusatory, and the audience immediately perked up, sensing another round of fireworks. He turned toward her, pointing a finger for emphasis. "You've spent this entire evening appealing to emotions, framing policies through personal anecdotes and feel-good narratives. But let's be clear. Governance isn't about sentimentality. It's about results. And when you prioritize emotion over evidence, you risk making decisions that harm more people than they help." His words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. Some members of the audience nodded approvingly, while others shifted uncomfortably. For a moment, it seemed like Richard might have regained some ground. After all, his argument wasn't entirely wrong. Emotions alone couldn't solve complex problems. But then she leaned into the microphone, ready to respond. "You're absolutely right," she began, her voice steady and measured. "Governance is about results. But here's the thing. Emotions aren't separate from results. They're part of them. When someone loses their job because of a trade deal, that's not just a statistic, it's a life-altering event. When a family can't afford health care, that's not just a policy failure, it's a crisis. Ignoring those realities doesn't make you objective, it makes you disconnected." Her response drew murmurs of agreement from the crowd. She continued, her tone growing firmer. "What I'm advocating for isn't abandoning evidence or logic. It's about balancing them with empathy. Good leaders don't just look at spreadsheets. They look at faces. They listen to voices. And yes, sometimes they make tough choices that don't fit neatly into academic models, because real life is messy, and leadership requires understanding that." The applause erupted again, louder, this time. People were visibly moved, nodding along as if she had articulated something they'd always felt but struggled to put into words. Even Richard seemed momentarily stunned, though he quickly masked it with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Empathy is important," he conceded grudgingly, "but it can't replace expertise. You're painting a picture of heart versus head, but effective policymaking requires both. What worries me is that your approach prioritizes short-term wins over long-term stability." She didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled. A small, knowing smile that suggested she'd been waiting for this exact moment. "And what worries me," she countered, "is that your approach prioritizes theory over reality. Tell me this. How many times have you sat down with someone whose livelihood depends on the policies you critique? Have you ever walked a mile in their shoes? Or are you content to judge their lives from the comfort of your lecture hall?" The question hit like a punch. The audience leaned forward collectively, hanging on every word. Richard hesitated, caught off guard by the directness of her challenge. He stammered slightly before regaining his composure. "I don't need to walk in anyone's shoes to understand economic principles," he replied, though his voice lacked its usual certainty. "Data speaks for itself." "Does it?" she shot back, raising an eyebrow. "Because data doesn't cry when a parent can't feed their child. Data doesn't lose sleep wondering how to pay rent. Data doesn't feel hope or despair. Those are human experiences, and if we ignore them, we fail as leaders." The room went silent, save for the sound of cameras clicking and pens scratching notes. Richard opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. For the first time all evening, he looked unsure of himself. The moderator stepped in, sensing the moment needed no further commentary. "Well," the moderator said, breaking the silence, "it seems we've reached the end of our time. Thank you both for such a lively and thought-provoking discussion." The audience erupted into applause once more, many rising to their feet in a standing ovation. Cameras flashed wildly, capturing the historic moment. As the moderator wrapped things up, Richard gathered his notes and stood up abruptly, avoiding eye contact with anyone. He muttered a quick thank you to the staff before heading toward the exit, his face unreadable. Meanwhile, she remained seated for a moment, taking it all in. The weight of what had just happened began to settle over her. She hadn't come into this expecting to win, or even to hold her own against someone like Richard. But now, looking around at the cheering crowd and the messages pouring in on social media, she realized something profound. She had struck a chord. Her words had resonated not because they were perfect or polished, but because they were authentic. They came from a place of genuine care for the people she represented. After a few minutes, she stood up and made her way toward the backstage area. Along the way, strangers stopped her to shake her hand or offer words of encouragement. Some thanked her for standing up to Richard. Others simply told her how much they appreciated hearing someone speak so passionately about everyday struggles. Each interaction reminded her why she did this work in the first place. Backstage, the atmosphere was electric. Staff members and supporters surrounded her, congratulating her on a job well done. Someone handed her a bottle of water and she took a long sip, finally allowing herself to relax. A producer approached her, asking if she'd be open to doing a post-debate interview. She agreed, knowing this was an opportunity to keep the momentum going. When the cameras rolled again, she spoke candidly about the experience. "Tonight wasn't about me versus him," she said. "It was about reminding ourselves that politics should serve people, not the other way around. Too often we get caught up in debates that feel abstract or disconnected from reality. My goal tonight was to bring it back to basics: what works, what matters, and who benefits." Her comments resonated deeply, earning praise from viewers across the political spectrum. Even critics admitted that she had brought a fresh perspective to the conversation, one rooted in humanity rather than ideology. As the night wore on, Richard retreated to his hotel room, replaying the debate in his mind. He couldn't deny that he had underestimated his opponent. Her ability to connect with the audience had blindsided him, exposing a vulnerability he hadn't anticipated. For years, he had prided himself on his intellectual superiority, believing that facts and figures would always triumph over emotion. But tonight, he had learned otherwise. The next morning, headlines blared with news of the debate. Clips of key moments dominated social media feeds, sparking conversations far beyond the confines of the studio. Supporters hailed her as a rising star in conservative politics, while detractors accused her of pandering to populist sentiments. Either way, one thing was clear: she had made an impact. For Richard, the aftermath was humbling. Critics pounced on his condescending tone, accusing him of alienating the very audience he claimed to educate. Interviews and articles dissected his performance, with many pointing out how his reliance on academic jargon had fallen flat in the face of raw authenticity. Though he continued to appear in public forums, his credibility took a noticeable hit. Meanwhile, she returned to her daily routine, energized by the experience. The debate had opened doors she hadn't imagined, bringing new opportunities and challenges, but more importantly, it had reaffirmed her belief in the power of storytelling. Policies might shape the world, but stories shape hearts, and sometimes that's enough to change everything. The days following the debate felt like a whirlwind. The young woman returned to her apartment late one night, exhausted but buzzing with energy. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since the event ended. Texts, calls, emails, and social media notifications flooded in nonstop. Friends, colleagues, and even strangers were reaching out to congratulate her or share how much her words had resonated with them. Some sent heartfelt messages about feeling seen for the first time in political discussions, while others simply said, "Thank you." At first, she tried to keep up with all the responses, typing replies between bites of leftover pizza. But soon it became overwhelming. She realized there was no way to respond to everyone individually, so she settled on posting a short message on Twitter instead. To everyone who reached out, she wrote, "Thank you for your kindness and support. This wasn't just my voice, it was ours. Let's keep pushing forward together." The post went viral almost instantly, racking up thousands of likes and shares within hours. People commented with stories of their own struggles and triumphs, turning the thread into a tapestry of shared experiences. It was humbling and inspiring all at once. For the first time, she truly understood the ripple effect of standing up for what you believe in. Meanwhile, Richard retreated from the public eye for a few days. He canceled scheduled appearances and declined interview requests, claiming he needed time to focus on upcoming projects. But behind closed doors, he wrestled with frustration and self-doubt. Friends close to him noticed a change, an uncharacteristic quietness that lingered long after the debate ended. During rare moments when he did speak about it, his tone carried a mix of irritation and defensiveness. "How could I have misjudged her?" he muttered during a phone call with a colleague. "She wasn't supposed to be this compelling." His friend hesitated before responding. "Maybe that's the point," they said gently. "You went in expecting to win because of your credentials, but she won because of her connection with people. Sometimes facts aren't enough." Richard didn't reply, but the comment stuck with him. Over the next few weeks, he found himself replaying clips of the debate, not to critique her performance, but to analyze his own. He cringed at moments where his sarcasm veered into condescension and winced at interruptions that made him seem impatient. For someone who prided himself on intellectual rigor, these missteps felt glaringly obvious now. Publicly, however, Richard maintained his usual confident demeanor. In interviews, he dismissed criticisms of his tone as irrelevant, insisting that substance mattered more than style. Yet privately, he began rethinking his approach. Maybe empathy wasn't such a bad thing after all. Maybe connecting with people didn't mean sacrificing credibility, it meant expanding it. For the young woman, life changed in subtle but significant ways. Invitations poured in from organizations eager to feature her as a speaker or panelist. Conservative think tanks asked her to contribute articles, while grassroots groups invited her to rallies and town halls. At first, she worried about taking on too much, fearing that stepping into the spotlight might overshadow the causes she cared about. But then she remembered why she'd accepted the debate challenge in the first place: to amplify voices that often went unheard. She started traveling, more meeting people across the country who reminded her of why she loved this work. In rural towns, she sat down with farmers worried about trade policies affecting their livelihoods. In urban neighborhoods, she listened to parents struggling to afford childcare. Each conversation reinforced her belief that good policy starts with listening, and that leadership is about service, not superiority. One evening, after speaking at a community forum, a man approached her with tears in his eyes. "I've been watching you ever since that debate," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "You gave me hope again. Hope that maybe someone out there actually cares about folks like us." Her throat tightened as she shook his hand. "I do care," she replied softly. "And I promise I'll keep fighting for you." Moments like these fueled her determination to stay grounded, despite the growing attention. She turned down lucrative offers from networks and brands, choosing instead to focus on initiatives that aligned with her values. When asked about her future plans in interviews, she always emphasized the importance of collaboration over individual achievement. "I'm not here to build a personal brand," she told one reporter. "I'm here to remind people that their voices matter. If anything, I want to use this platform to lift others up, not stand above them." As months passed, the debate continued to spark conversations online and offline. Teachers used clips from it in classrooms to discuss rhetorical strategies and civic engagement. Journalists referenced it in opinion pieces exploring the intersection of emotion and evidence in policymaking. Even comedians joked about Richard's infamous smirk, turning it into a meme that circulated widely. But beyond the jokes and analyses, the debate left a lasting impression on those who watched it live. Many viewers cited it as a turning point, a reminder that politics isn't just about winning arguments, it's about understanding each other. Some admitted they had initially dismissed her based on preconceived notions, only to be surprised by her depth and authenticity. Others confessed that Richard's condescension had alienated them, prompting them to reconsider their views on elitism in intellectual circles. By the end of the year, both participants had evolved in different ways. Richard returned to public discourse with a slightly softer edge, incorporating more relatable examples into his critiques. While he still leaned heavily on data and theory, he made an effort to acknowledge opposing perspectives without dismissing them outright. Critics noted the shift, praising him for adapting rather than doubling down. For the young woman, the journey was just beginning. She became a sought-after voice in conservative circles, known not just for defending policies but for humanizing them. Her speeches often included stories from real people she'd met along the way, stories that illustrated the complexities of modern life better than any statistic could. Audiences responded enthusiastically, finding comfort in her honesty and optimism. Looking back, she realized the debate had taught her something profound. Courage isn't about having all the answers, it's about showing up anyway. Whether facing criticism, doubt, or fear, she had learned that authenticity resonates far more deeply than perfection ever could. And Richard? Though reluctant to admit it publicly, he came to respect her tenacity, if not her ideology. In a rare moment of candor during a podcast appearance, he acknowledged that underestimating his opponent had been a mistake. "She reminded me," he said thoughtfully, "that ideas don't exist in a vacuum. They shape lives, and if we forget that, we lose sight of what matters most." In the end, the clash between Richard and the young woman wasn't just a battle of ideologies. It was a lesson in humility, empathy, and the power of storytelling. Both walked away changed, carrying lessons that would shape their paths moving forward. And though they never debated again, their encounter became a defining chapter in the ongoing struggle to bridge divides and find common ground in a fractured world.